Okay, when I say the name Merlin, I bet this is what pops into your head, right? The wise old wizard with the long white beard, King Arthur's advisor, the most powerful sorcerer in all of Camelot. It's an image we all know, we all love. But what if I told you that the real story is actually way stranger and honestly a lot more interesting than the myth we've all been told? Which, of course, leads us to the million-dollar question people have been asking for centuries. Did he, did he really exist? Was there ever a real man with these incredible powers walking around ancient Britain? Well, the short answer from historians, it might actually surprise you. It's probably not. Yeah, at least not in the way we think of him, not as one single, all-powerful, magical guy. But that's where things get good, because the real story is so much more complex and, frankly, way more fascinating than the simple legend. Okay, so to figure out who the real Merlin might have been, we first have to tackle the one we think we know, you know? We've got to peel back the layers of the legend, understand the fiction first, before we can even begin to dig for the facts. So yeah, this is him. This is the Merlin of pop culture. He's King Arthur's go-to guy, his right-hand man. He's the ultimate sorcerer who can see the future, cast insane spells, basically bend reality to his will. I mean, let's be honest, he's the OG, the blueprint for pretty much every wizard that came after him. We're talking Gandalf, Dumbledore, the whole lot. This is the version we're going to take apart today. All right, so if the guy in the pointy hat is basically fiction, where did this whole idea even come from? Well, this is where we have to put on our detective hats. We're going to trace the clues back through history, back through literature, to find the real origin of this incredible myth. See, Merlin wasn't just invented overnight. He was built, piece by piece, over almost 1,000 years. It all starts way back in the 6th century. You've got these old Welsh legends about a wild prophet, a bard named Merlin Wilt. Fast forward a few hundred years to about 1136. A writer named Geoffrey of Monmouth takes those old stories, mashes them together, and creates the character he calls Merlin. But it's not until the 15th century, with Sir Thomas Malory's famous book, Le Morte d'Arthur, that he really becomes the master magician we all picture today. So what exactly went into Geoffrey of Monmouth's recipe for Merlin? What were the ingredients? Well, first he took the stories of this Merlin Wilt, this prophet who supposedly went mad after a battle and ran off to live in the forest. Then he stirred in some stories about a real-life war hero, a Romano-British leader named Ambrosius Aurelianus. And for the final seasoning, he sprinkled in the classic Celtic archetype of the wise man, the druid or the bard, a figure who was deeply respected for their wisdom and their insight. And this brings us to a really crucial question. If the original Merlin figure wasn't a sorcerer with a wand, then what were his powers supposed to be? Was it really magic, or was it something else completely? It actually helps to look at the word itself. The word wizard, it originally just meant wise men. It comes from the Middle English word wizard. So the figures who inspired the legend, they never would have called themselves wizards. No way. They were known as bards or poets or seers. This whole idea of supernatural magic, that was tacked on much, much later. So, okay, if these guys were just seen as wise men, when did people start calling what they did magic? Because in the oldest stories, they just didn't. His abilities were described as things like prophecy or poetry, or even this kind of wild insight that came from madness, but definitely not sorcery. And right here, you can see this transformation happen right before your eyes. Take the story of moving Stonehenge. In the early versions, it's described as an incredible feat of engineering, something done by art. Later on, poof, it's a magical enchantment. Knowing the future, it started as just really sharp political foresight and observation. Later, it becomes supernatural prophecy. And what about influencing events? Well, that began as just giving brilliant strategic advice, using psychology. But that gets turned into shape-shifting and casting illusions. In every single case, you see practical, real-world genius getting rebranded as supernatural magic. Now, it's really important to put this all in context. A figure like the early Merlin, a super smart advisor to a king, that wasn't some weird one-off thing. He was absolutely a product of his time, and he definitely wasn't the only one. In fact, The job that Merlin did was a totally recognized and respected position in early medieval society. Think about it. Every king, every court needed its wise man. They needed a strategist, a keeper of history and lore. This was a serious, high-stakes, and probably pretty competitive job. And like I said, he wasn't alone. The Welsh tradition was just packed with these poet-prophets. You had other famous figures like Taliesin, who was another well-known seer, and Aneurin, a court poet who was basically a historian. You even had rivals coming from a different corner, like Saint Kentigern. He represented the new wave of Christian knowledge, which was competing with the old Celtic traditions. So yeah, Merlin was part of a whole world of these kinds of figures. And of course, as the legend got bigger and bigger over the centuries, the storytellers started adding more characters to make the world richer. It's like building a cast for a TV show, right? Suddenly, you've got Morgan Le Fay, his magical nemesis. You have Nimue, his own student who ends up being his downfall. There's even Blaise, a priest who acts as his personal scribe, writing down all his prophecies. This whole network of characters just made the story that much more epic and compelling. Okay, so let's get to the final and maybe most important piece of the puzzle. Why? Why did all this happen? Why did this figure of a wise man, a brilliant engineer and strategist, slowly morph into the pointy hat-wearing sorcerer we know today? Well, it's basically a simple recipe for how to build a myth. Step 1, you start with a real-world archetype, the respected advisor. Step 2, you rebrand their skills. Wisdom and knowledge, that becomes spellcasting. Step 3, you dial up the drama. An amazing engineering feat becomes a stone-moving enchantment. And finally, step 4, the most important one, you've got to entertain your audience. And let's face it, magic is just way more exciting and easier to understand than the nitty-gritty of political strategy in 6th century Britain. It just makes for a better story. And this quote really nails it. See, the early audiences, they valued knowledge because of the real-world power it gave you. But over time, storytellers needed something splashier. They needed more flair to keep people hooked. So they just amped up the story. And the wise man, the sage, got a magical makeover into a sorcerer. So I'm going to leave you with this one last thing to chew on. When we imagine Merlin, the great wizard, what are we really celebrating? Are we just enjoying a fun story about a fictional sorcerer? Or are we connecting with a kind of distant cultural memory? A memory of a time when real-world knowledge, things like engineering, political strategy, deep learning, was so powerful and so rare that to the average person, it looked and felt exactly like magic.